On the last video, I talked about what was one of the biggest updates in Battle Cats. I mentioned that one of the updates that shifts the game balance really wildly was the update that introduces the long distance ability. But LD Cats are just one part of the equation of many things that actually shifts the Battle Cats game balance in a major way. So there's actually yet another update that is very related to long distance that was really massive when it comes to shifting the game balance as a whole. And funnily enough, this update is only one update before the introduction of LD. At version 4.5, the third chapter of Into the Future has been completed, which at the same time introduces us to the third form of your Bahamut cat, Awakened Bahamut. Awakened Bahamut as a unit is completely different from his previous forms. Before, Crazed Bahamut was just a generic ranged generalist unit with good standing range, slow attack speed, slow movement, that kind of just sits at the back while dealing a big amount of damage every once in a while. It's a very standard generalist unit. But Awakened Bahamut is a completely different beast, going from a range attacker to a melee rusher unit. Instead of going for a long ranger approach, Awakened Bahamut is a unit with extreme speed both in movement and attack. He also still retains his gigantic damage per hit, so with his newfound attack speed, his DPS goes up dramatically. There was almost no cat in the game like this at the time, except for Yukimura, and even then Awakened Bahamut's damage output was just so high that Yukimura gets overshadowed. Nowadays, every player knows how incredibly powerful Awakened Bahamut is, and you can imagine how the community at the time was really surprised to see Awakened Bahamut stats being revealed for the first time. But you know what the funny thing is? Back when the update first released, there was actually a lot of doubt surrounding Awakened Bahamut. In fact, there's actually some people that prefer Crazed Bahamut over Awakened Bahamut. It wasn't really like a strong popular opinion, but that opinion still exists. And I know for a lot of people, nowadays that would sound really crazy. I mean, Crazed Bahamut is terrible, and Awakened Bahamut is basically a meta unit. How is Awakened Bahamut like somehow a downgrade or anything? Well, one thing you gotta understand is that at the time, there was somewhat of a specific mindset when it comes to knowing which units are good or not when it comes to Battle Cats. In the more olden day, the one stats that is absolutely important and is basically above all was standing range. Standing range is always very vital as a stat, because if you want to counter specific enemies, you have to outrange them. I've also mentioned this a little bit in my previous long distance ability video, but back then, knowing range is key. Not being able to outrange certain enemies means you won't work on those enemies at all. Units with low range are only used if they're meat shields, or if they're a tanker or rusher that can deal with higher range backliner enemies like Kamel or Master A, or tanking wave attacks from Cory and Dober. That's really all the extent of what melee units are used for. Awakened Bahamut with its only 200 range was not really able to outrange anything outside of peons, and its short range means that Awakened Bahamut dies way more quickly, even if Awakened Bahamut has a lower cooldown. Meanwhile, Crazed Bahamut with its 450 range is able to survive for a much longer amount of time, sitting at a much safer position. In the longer run, Crazed Bahamut can deal more damage than Awakened Bahamut, and with a much further reach too. If there's a lot of peons in the stage, Awakened Bahamut might not even be able to hit certain key enemies at all before dying. So in many situations, Crazed Bahamut is seen to be a better pick than Awakened Bahamut sometimes. It's a very insane statement nowadays, I know, but at the time it sort of did make sense. But like I mentioned, Awakened Bahamut still gets its usages here and there since it is a rusher, so it can be used to finish off high range enemies. Aside from that, since it still have a huge amount of damage, he was still kind of used in the same way that you would use Manic Flying Cat as a mid-ranger unit to burst down some of the more tankier melee enemies, especially ones that can do waves like Dober. But it didn't really take that long for Awakened Bahamut to really find his placing. As I've mentioned, only an update later is when LD is introduced in the game. But LD is not just for cats, we also got LD enemies. If you want to learn more about LD and how they work, you can go watch my previous video about the LD update, or you can watch another older video here that are more specific about mechanic regarding how LD and Omni Strike work. But basically, the introduction of LD enemies shakes up a lot of things, especially how newer stages are built around, and a lot of meta for lineup creation shifts ever so slightly. A lot of generic range units have started to lose their footing a little bit. You see, before the introduction of LD enemies, majority of the time your lineup will more or less be something like 3 or 4 meat shields, maybe some debuffers, and then the rest are just high range units like Paris Cat, Dragon, Bahamut, Ururun, and so on. The meta is having good meat shielding and a lot of powerful range attack attackers, especially ones that are stackable, which is why Paris Cat used to be considered to be one of the best units in the game. But with the introduction of LD enemies, things start to change. Since LD enemies have piercing range, they are able to just bypass your meat shielding and just go straight into attacking your range attackers. A lot of range attackers are not really safe even behind meat shields now, and so units like Paris Cat that relies on having to be stacked up doesn't really work properly anymore. A lot of these units starts to struggle whenever there's an LD enemy supporting the frontline enemies. In fairness, it's not all bad though. To balance the threat of LD enemies, a lot of stages that features LD enemies would also generally have slightly weaker pusher in the stage. For example, they might pair LD enemies with some more glass cannon enemies, or occasional somewhat semi-strong peons, but not really something that is too strong, just to make the stage more balanced. That being said, there are some stages that features LD enemies and strong and tanky pushers like Bun Bun and Arost, and they usually end up being some of the most infamously difficult stages in SOL. But a lot of the times, LD enemies are usually paired with more glass cannon-y enemies, and these are where shorter range units can really thrive. Shorter range units tend to deal more damage compared to the ones that have high range, but a lot of the times they're usually not seen to be as worth using, as they die pretty quickly compared to those that have higher range and don't counter as much enemies. But if you're under the threat of LD enemies and LD enemies are going to snipe all of your units anyways, then you might as well just choose a unit that can deal as much damage before they die. That's why sometimes having bigger damage can be way more worth than having higher range. Hell, if you have high enough damage, then you might be able to steamroll the enemies and potentially even push into the LD enemy's blind spot. Alright, speaking of blind spot, the fact that some LD enemies have blind spot can mean two things for the cat unit meta. One is now sometimes having higher range can actually be detrimental. If your unit's range is too high, that would be the prime target for a lot of LD enemies. Hell, sometimes that also means that some units with too high of a range can't enter the enemy's blind spot, so having something like a mid-range might actually be better. And two is that now speed is a stat that actually matters. I mean, not that like speed was completely useless before. If you're trying to tank backliners like Manister A or Kamels, speed can still matter pretty well. But now speed also really matters in whether you can enter the enemy's blind spot or not. So you might see why Awakened Bahamut really finds its calling here. Not only that his range has been completely changed from being a high ranger to a short melee unit, his speed also increases dramatically. He's perfect for LD enemies. Eventually, players starts to really understand on how to truly use Awakened Bahamut as a proper unit. And one of its biggest revelation as to how powerful Awakened Bahamut can be was when we got our first deadly advent stage, No Plan A. No Plan A features Cruel Angel Clionel, a very powerful backliner LD enemy with very high range, constant attack rate, and a very proper damage too, being able to kill basically anything that isn't too tanky in one shot. In this stage, Clionel's LD isn't as easy to enter. It's often guarded by Angelic Gories, which are very aggressive peons, as well as Slipnir, a mid to high range enemies that's always been generally troublesome as a range enemy. During its release, the entire community was very struggling against No Plan A. Even people with Ubers was struggling against this stage. A lot of people believe that Gamerion is a must-have unit in this stage. Gamerion is a tanky mid-ranger unit that can tank a lot of hits from Clionel and Slipnir, and it still have a good enough range to outrange the Gories and Slipnir. But even with owning Gamerion, you can still lose if you are not doing well on the damage department, especially because of Slipnir. Slipnir in particular is a very troublesome enemy. It has a constant attack with a chance of knockback, so short and mid-range units have a very hard time hitting Slipnir at all, as they're probably going to get constantly interrupted by the knockback ability. Normally, the way people deal with Slipnir is simply by using range attackers like Dragon Cat or Ururun or Craze Bahamut and such. But Clionel's always going to destroy any range attackers that you might have in front of Slipnir, so dealing with this combination can be really difficult. And so, people got creative. Several players and guide makers at the time starts to really experiment with Awakened Bahamut, as they realize that this is truly Awakened Bahamut's true calling. And they've made the discovery that you can actually use Awakened Bahamut on Slipnir. This might be common knowledge now, but going for a unit that has lower range than Slipnir to counter it was unheard of at the time. That's crazy talk. But Awakened Bahamut is no mere melee unit. He's a very fast rusher, and being a quick rusher, Awakened Bahamut can get inside Slipnir's range. He still needs to tank a couple of hits, but as long as you're lucky enough to not get constantly knocked back, Bahamut can land a couple of hits. And a couple of hits is all Bahamut needs to cripple and potentially even even kill Sleipnir in one go. If you're able to pull that off, Lionel would be defenseless, at least before the next Sleipnir arrives. So you would be under time limit to kill Lionel as fast as possible, or at the very least cripple it and then repeat the process for the next wave. This strategy was initially developed by Caxer and then later improved by Nurse Wufa to be a more accessible strat. And this strat is still currently being used as a baseline for modern No Plan A guide. But again, this was super revolutionary at the time. Nobody really would ever think of using a melee unit to deal with Sleipnir, so the knowledge that people can just use Awakened Bahamut for Sleipnir of all things got more player thinking. If he works for Sleipnir, what else can he be used for? Eventually, players also figured out something called Bahamut chaining. Due to Bahamut's incredibly high damage per hit and his long backswing animation, if you're able to knock enemies back in one hit from Bahamut, then the enemy might be knocked back far enough that Bahamut would stay in a safe distance. You can then maybe bait the enemy or stall the enemy until Bahamut is ready to go again, and then you can just repeat the process over and over, constantly knocking the enemies back until either the enemy dies or you mess up somewhere because another enemy blocks you or something. This Bahamut chaining strat can be used on nearly any enemies that Bahamut can knock back in one hit. If you can isolate those enemies alone without the interruption from other enemies, then you'll be able to basically assassinate them with Bahamut chaining, or at least cripple them really hard. Bahamut chaining is incredibly powerful. Crippling or even outright killing certain key enemies in the stage can break certain stages hard, especially in some of the more modern stages at the time. Like I mentioned, a lot of modern stages starts to shift in terms of how they are designed. Stages are less of like spamming a lot of peons and more so like putting a couple of few certain key enemies in the stage that have synergy with each other. A lot of these are usually kind of like mid-boss enemies or like glass cannon enemies. Just like cats, enemies are also still working as a team. A lot of enemy combinations have like certain synergies to make them actually work. There's rarely any enemies that are a threat when they're completely alone. Even the most threatening enemy in the game can be easily taken down if they don't have proper supports at all. But that also means that if you take one part of the team down, then the whole stage itself can crumble. And that's exactly what rushers like Awakened Bahamut can do. If you can take out certain key enemies out of the equation, or at the very least take them down fast enough before they form a coherent synergy, then you might basically just completely break certain stages beyond recognition. Of course, this is not something exclusive to Awakened Bahamut. This can be true for many other rushers and nukers, including units like Yukimura. Yukimura was an older unit, even compared to Awakened Bahamut, but he was also rather underused and underutilized. But as more people understand rushers more and more, and stage design also starts to shift to become more rusher friendly, Yuki goes from a rather underutilized unit to become a relatively meta unit that everyone knows now. Of course, this is not just true for rushers, but also general nuker units, including units like Balrog or Can-Can. These two units actually didn't get that much usage back in the days, mainly because a lot of older stages just spam a lot of enemies, and Balrog and Can-Can, being this melee short range unit, don't really have much stages where they shine on. A lot of the times they would just get blocked by a lot of peons. But in modern stages, they can fit in perfectly. Nukers like this have similar advantages as rushers, and similar reasons to be used as rushers. They go in, they deal big damage, and they probably die, but really that's all they gotta do. They're disposable units. They're not meant to last long. Nukers and rushers kind of have a similar role and similar advantages. In fact, there's a lot of rushers that are also nukers and vice versa. Bahamut and Yukimura are included. This is also the case for Maglev Cat, which is the unit that you get from Hanya, although Maglev is more of a nuker than a rusher. Maglev is extremely speedy and is accurate at attacking, and have really big damage per hit too. Maglev also has the ability to double your cash drop as long as it's the one that deals the final hit. If you're able to guesstimate correctly on which enemy has low health, you can snipe them off with Maglev to be rewarded with a big amount of cash. These rusher/nuker units are incredibly cool because these were some of the only time where battle cats actually have some sort of like skill-based or timing-based gameplay, you know? A lot of the times if you want to win, you just need to have a good enough lineup and a good enough way to manage your money. As long as you can strategize your lineup well, the gameplay itself is just spamming your meat shields and spamming your range attackers until you win. But LD enemies as well as rusher units starts to really shake things up and makes a lot of things more interesting. Now players actually kind of have to care about timings and stuff. But on the other hand, this also means that they don't really need to care much about range numbers. Very similar to what happened to LD cats. If a rusher is fast enough, then they would probably be able to hit basically majority of enemy in the games anyways. Hell, if they're fast enough, you might be able to hit even a lot of things that LD units can't hit. Let me take up another example of a rusher nuker unit, Heavy Assault CAT, the true form for Boxcat. This unit was previously already somewhat of a rusher in the previous forms, but it was kind of lacking in stats, so it's not really usable anywhere past the early game. But later on, the true form and talents gives them proper stats and the ability to deal massive damage against black enemies. This makes them able to hit black enemies that are hard to hit usually, or just clearing down black peons even under the threat of high-range backliners. CAT's competition is usually Pizza Cat, another anti-black mid-ranger. Pizza is much superior than CAT in a lot of ways, from range to health, and even have amazing talents of like wave attacks and so on. Most of the time you're going to use Pizza for most black enemies due to how powerful he is, but Pizza is incredibly slow, and that sometimes can be a hindrance. If your black enemy target is protected by strong backliner, or if the enemy's range is too high, then Pizza might not really work that well. But CAT, having high speed, can work under pressure and even snipe down high-range enemies, giving it more edge over Pizza in some cases. CAT works in a lot of stages, especially ones that have like occasional black peons that you need to kill as quickly as possible, or basically any time when Pizza is too slow to work. Even with generally inferior stats, just having high speed alone can give you a lot of edge in a lot of situations. Speaking of, let's talk about some other newer rushdown units. One that is very infamous is Courier Cat. Courier is also a speedy attacker with massive damage against red, but his damage per hit isn't actually as big as CAT. His true insanity is on his low cooldown. You can spam this guy a lot, and he's pretty cheap too. This low cooldown gets even more amplified by research combo if you have them, which can be incredibly broken. And if you want to learn about why that's broken, I have a video talking about research combo, go watch that if you're interested. But yeah, on top of that, Courier also only has 2 knockback counts and a pretty good bulk of health, so he can tank through certain attacks without getting interrupted as easily. If he's boosted enough, he can even tank hits from like Professor A without getting knocked back. But Professor A can appear in higher magnification, and in that case, Courier might need some help to actually hit them. You can do this by like freeze or weakening the Professor A. If you weaken the Professor A, then Courier can take another hit before getting knocked back. The combination of debuffs and rushers are very powerful, and it's exactly what I'm going to talk about now actually. Units or abilities that can support rushers are also becoming more and more relevant. Whatever units that can reliably weaken enemies can help a lot in assisting rushers. Combining the weaken ability and rusher units can be very deadly, as it allows a lot of rushers to be able to tank through higher range enemies, and even allows some units with rebound to potentially amplify their damage by a massive amount. But luckily, most weakened units are usually pretty reliable, either having good proc chance or very good proc duration. But you would know all about that if you've already watched my previous video about weakened and how they're a good ability, right? But anyways, aside from weaken, freeze is also an incredible ability to support rushers and nukers, just basically giving free reign for rushers to deal as much damage as possible as long as the enemies are frozen. But freeze are usually less consistent, or at the very least is harder to land, so having a reliable unit that can freeze is not as common as weaken. Man, if only we have something that allows us to freeze enemies whenever we like. Alright, we do! Thunderbolt Cannon. Version 6.0 introduces Ototo Corpse, a way to upgrade your base, and also different cat cannons. One of those new cannon is the Thunderbolt Cannon. This will swap your usual cat cannon into a Thunderbolt that freezes enemy closest to the furthest cat you have in the field. Normally, if you're purely trying to stop enemies from advancing, then the other cannons, Slow Beam and Iron Wall, is actually preferable as they have a much longer duration compared to Thunderbolt. And all of these can basically stop enemies dead in their tracks anyways. But Thunderbolt Cannon becomes an extremely key component in making a lot of rushers and nukers work, especially nukers. Having the ability to keep your units safe for a second or two can be a game changer in the right situation. Some nuker units might have a lot of trouble hitting enemies under normal circumstances, and that's where Thunderbolt becomes really powerful. Just allowing a hit or two from powerful nukers to land can be an absolute game changer. Freeze Cannon isn't the only reliable freeze though. Something like iCat and Bomber have guaranteed freeze, and they also have pretty good speed too. But usually trying to use them to assist rushers are either only in very specific scenarios or require some sort of heavy setup. It still works though, mind you. But let me go to another better example. Doron. Doron is a suicide unit that guarantees a freeze on Relic for an incredibly long amount of time. Being able to keep enemies frozen for this long is stupidly powerful if you pair them with rushers and nukers. Combining Doron with basically anything with high damage output can essentially kill like majority of Relic enemies. Doron is is stupidly powerful. I mean, honestly, Doron, even without the freeze, is already a pretty good unit. It's cheap, it deals a good amount of damage, it even has lingering surge. So having like a very long freeze that is also guaranteed is so extra. And it's especially worse for relics because we have Edie as a nuker. Edie is basically Yukimura for relics. It has incredibly high damage per hit and nukes down relic enemies really hard. With how powerful its damage per hit is, you can kind of do like an Edie chain similar to Bahamut chain too. This can even work for some tanky bosses like the Infernal Tower bosses. And Edie doesn't have to be alone. It can still employ the help of like Doron to freeze them, or Nala to weaken the enemies, or your own Uril unit to keep the enemy Uril in place. The amount of rushers, nukers, and nuker supports that we have over the years have been increasing rapidly. And they're not just increasing in numbers, they've also been getting stronger and stronger. A lot of really powerful meta units nowadays are either rushers or nukers too, like Slime, Super Feline, Hitman, Cafeteria, and these are just a few select non-Uber ones. I've barely even scratched the surface on what they've done to Ubers. If you've been following the recent updates, we also recently got Zeta Skanda. This guy is basically the unit for nuker support. Not only do they have fast speed and guaranteed weaken on multiple traits, but it also has a conjure ability that can freeze enemies, basically giving you a second Thunderbolt cannon in your arsenal. This unit is a weaken on demand and freeze on demand unit all in one. It's the ultimate nuker support. I've yet to see that much footage of this guy, but I've got a feeling that this unit can be incredible to support a lot of rushers and nuker strategies. And currently, rush strategies are probably at its peak, because, as you may know, we've recently got the introduction of Bahamut's Cat's explosion talent. Awakened Bahamut's explosion is probably one of the most questionable, insane thing that Ponos has done in the recent years. Or maybe just in the history of Battle Cats in general. Unlocking the explosion talent for Awakened Bahamut is stupidly powerful. The explosion basically doubles his damage output, and on top of that also gives an extra piercing range and lingering hitbox. This unit is just really nuts. On top of that, remember the thing that I mentioned about Bahamut chaining? Well, Bahamut chaining usually won't work if the enemy is too tanky. If they're too tanky, then Bahamut can't knock them back in one hit, and then Bahamut chain would fail. But Bahamut's blast doubling that damage lowers that damage threshold significantly. Now the amount of enemies that can potentially get Bahamut chain skyrocketed. Even tanky enemies like Bunbuns or even higher star magnification of HNAV variants are not safe. And this guy exists alongside things like level 30 Thunderbolt, Doron, Zorakti's Weaken Conjure, and many other things that can amplify Bahamut's insane rampage. You know what, it's difficult to put into words how truly bonkers this guy is, so here, have a montage. Yeah. Awakened Bahamut is not only the best rusher in the game, but arguably maybe even the best unit in the game, period. BAHA-BLAST is easily one of the most broken thing that Ponos has ever done, especially in the meta where rushers are king. It has become incredibly difficult to find a fine line to make a stage that is actually challenging without trying to make it too absurd. But in the process of trying to make a stage that counters rushers, you might just end up making another generic old stages that can be simply beaten by having usual meat shield and range stacking, which is just going back to roots. units. But it's true that these stages do usually counter rushers, but at the same time, these sort of stages usually just falls apart if you use a bunch of meat shield and then just stack generic ranged LD units. You know, the exact same thing that I've mentioned in the last video. You either get destroyed by busted LD units or you get destroyed by busted rusher units. And you know what the worst part is? There's some units that are both LD and a rusher, like Courier Cat. No wonder this guy's meta. He bypasses basically everything. That being said though, it's not like I hate rushers or I hate nukers by any mean. Like I mentioned, rushers and nukers are still really cool. Some of the most interesting units in the game are rushers and nukers. Maglev is a very fun cat to use, especially when trying to snipe down specific enemies for double cash. It's very satisfying if you land it correctly. Slime, despite how incredibly broken Slime is still mechanically a very cool unit. Heavy Assault CAT is still probably one of my favorite purchasable special cats ever. And Courier, okay, never mind, Courier's boring. And Bahamut, despite how incredibly broken it is, still needs some timing and care to use a lot of the times, and have some pretty cool and fun usages here and there. Bahamut chaining is still really fun to do, even if it's, you know, kind of overtuned at this point. Rushers are very interesting. It's both really cool while at the same time can potentially make the game a little bit boring in certain way as well. The Battle Cat's balancing is kind of already broken at this point, and it might be kind of impossible to really fix Battle Cats, especially in like the mid-game. Mid-game is probably hopeless. But it's definitely still possible to create future stages that are very interesting and not just die from like generic rushdown, because Ponos have shown that they can do it every once in a while, even without having to rely on like Colosseum restrictions and stuff. So it's definitely very doable if Ponos actually locks in. But looking at the current state of Zero Legends, I can't say I'm entirely positive, but I'm holding on to hope anyways. I know it's gonna be hard, but Ponos employee, if you're watching, I'm rooting for you to be able to create really cool stages in the future. These recent ZLs are not that great. But yeah, well, that's about it. Tell me what your favorite rushers or nukers are in the comments, or whether you think BAHA-BLAST is funny or is a crime against humanity. As per usual, like and subscribe or join the membership if you want. Go watch more of my videos if you're interested. I talk about funny cat game a lot and occasionally some other indie games. But yeah, I'll catch you another time. See ya.